So I wanted to just go into kind of what it is to be a woman, how you can become a woman. So the way that traditionally women became free or fulfilled their role was through fulfilling their roles as mothers and as wives. So you get married, you have kids, you raise them until they're no longer kids. And by the time that they reach old age, maybe once they become grandmothers, one Nuer woman, for example, that you interviewed and you included in this book, said that by the time they became grandparents, wives were basically considered sisters, or rather brothers, to their husbands, because at this point they didn't need them for anything. They had their own plots of land. These grandmothers had their own cattle.
It wasn't even grandmothers. It was. It could be much earlier. But definitely, if once you have a daughter married, or you have a son who's gone through initiation,
right,
you have independence on a long way.
Thank you. So yes, they get this independence, and
autonomy might be a good word.
Yes, their autonomy. I mean, they have their own lives, their own livelihoods, and their husbands no longer had this sort of kind of power over them. So this, and also instances of becoming a widow or a divorce, were ways that women were able to enjoy their autonomy and the fruits of their labor and the success of their children. So I wanted to know, I mean, the Second Civil War was, a huge event in so many ways. So can you say how the Second Civil War complicated this life trajectory for women?
Surely. Let's talk a little bit more about the life trajectory, just so we know. Before the Civil War, there were major impacts because the British, I mean, you know that when Evans Pritchard, there were no chiefs, there were no institutionalized rule. There were lots of ritual experts, as they called it, or men of cattle. There were prophets. There were powerful people on their own charisma. And if there was a fighting, the Nuer would get together and they would select a man to lead the fight, but only when there was fighting. Otherwise, everybody moved back to their sort of the homesteads and power in there. But once the courts came in, that introduced a lot of changes to the gender dynamics right away. So I just should I tell a little bit briefly about that before we get to the change of, because I think that's important to realize. So once, first of all, the British, I mean, this were coming out of the Victorian period, they did not accept the idea that women could be leaders, but there were women leaders, whether they're prophets or other female leaders who held sway. They may not have, and some leaders, women held their own homesteads, and some women married other women who gave them children. So the women's status maybe was a little higher than, but once the British came in and they made their rules, the courts now, if you think of it one way, they were trying to keep the peace. And so the courts always kind of leaned, how are we going to solve these court cases to keep the peace? But the people they selected for these court cases were generally, men in the prime of their height before, or older, and who were fathers, but also, husbands and, maybe grandfathers too. So these men, once they got a control of the courts, it's easy for me to see how some of the realm of autonomy of the women inside marriages began to be, shall we say, whittled away. How so? Well, let's adopt the position of a young woman who's going to be married. Now, already, if she's going to be married, she's married into strangers' families. So when she's going to go there, she's going to be, a new person in this strange family, hopefully lovingly received. Anyway, so if she's there, but they didn't send the wife there right away. You see, the traditional culture was that the woman would stay in her natal homestead, the husband would come and visit her, they would arrange for that privacy and stuff, and then until she got pregnant, and she might come visit, this and that, but her base was home, her own home. And it wasn't until she gave birth to her first child, and often weaned that child, that she finally moved to establish herself in that new household. Now, what does that mean? A woman entered her new family as a mother already. So she's already fulfilled part of her obligation. So there was a slow process of marriage. But with the courts, lots of things happen. If people got pregnant or whatever, the least line of least resistance for the courts was to marry them off so the fighting wouldn't start. So that changed things. But basically, at the time Evans Pritchard started, he said that a woman inside her marriage could not be divorced after she had given birth to 2 children. Now think about that. Let's say the husband, later on, the woman moves her husband and they have fights, or he hurts her or whatever. She can come running back to her native family who hold the bride wealth. And then the husband has to explain himself to her family about why she should come back or not. So the power of divorce lay with the people who received the blood rights cattle, which was her thing. Now, when you get to the courts, colonial, they took that power really from the natal wife's family and gave it to the courts. They didn't give it to the groom, but they gave it to the courts. So now it became possible for the chiefs in their wisdom, right, to decide in this particular case, we are going to either divorce this woman against your will, or we're going to, force her to go back against the will of her family. But they could literally grab the cows and transfer it which way, whatever, or not transfer it. So suddenly, the kind of power that the natal family had, serving as a marriage counseling service for their own daughter, if it were, was gone down. Okay, and in the process, certainly the groom side got some more power too, because now the big worry was, are they going to start fighting against each other, or is this going to cause violence? So, but from the woman's perspective, Evans Pritchard said two daughters, 2 children, and the natal family, they didn't have to worry about ever giving back these cows, because they could now, and their calves, because when you get divorced, you give the cows and all the calves if the husband knows about it. So they could feel free to use them in other brothers' marriages, knowing that, in terms of, it's as if the 2 people, individuals, is a starting point for the marriage, but over time, as the wife gives birth to children, it's really the 2 families and their interest as staying a united front, whether for defense or whatever, that takes precedence over whether the 2 people, as someone put it, never agree about anything, agree or not. So, but what happened with the court and with the British, there became a rationalization process, okay, they decided, they had the 1948 meetings, and, okay, and they didn't agree entirely, but East and West had different things, but if you get a divorce, the idea is, if she has children leaving, and the children would stay officially with the husband, then the husband has to leave certain cattle with the wife's family to claim paternity rights over this child. It doesn't matter if he was actually the physical or the genetic father, if you put it that way, the blood father or the sperm father. It was a matter of cows and names and who's the child. So the British or the chiefs began to rationalize. Okay, well, in some areas it's 6 cows for a boy and 4 cows, other 5 and 4. Well, if the cows, it's 25, well, maybe we can go up a bit more. And so from the wife's perspective, to get a solid piece of a footing in her home, where she cannot be threatened with divorce, she cannot be threatened to be separated forcefully from her children against her will. That you consider it almost like a probation period. And it would have gone just in the original way, from the nursing of the first child to the birth of the second and whatever. Now, infant mortality is another issue. But anyway, so, and if you got a child initiated or a daughter married, then you were definitely fine. So that gave the woman a certain amount of autonomy. And as she had more children, and the sons got older, the father gave certain cattle to them or for their future, or they had right to claim cattle. And the daughters, the mother gets cattle on the marriage of her daughters. So there was this probationary period, if you want to look at it, for a woman to feel solid in her home, had been extended by the courts, little by little. And in the process of that extension, sadly, all the woman's other contributions to the household, as someone who helps bring in the grain, milk, this and that, were kind of made invisible when it came to divorce. That didn't mean much. It was only her goal, her position, and like, how many children are there, and, you know, whatever this is. And so that in itself was a way of, I would think, muting the powerful women had over, you know, distribution of cooked food or whatever, milk, even water. So that was in my position, from what I see watching this over history, it weakened women's autonomy, and it was a court that was not very sympathetic to women's issues. And I can say even in the early 80s, there were differences in the court. So in the East, I can honestly say I saw hundreds of court cases. I have never seen a woman publicly given the right over her husband in the court. She could, you know, and she could not even sue directly for divorce. The only way she could trigger a divorce was to run away or whatever. So the man would sue. Now that was very, very different in the West. In the homestead of Kerlawal, who was head chief, I saw battered wives coming, and, you know, other things they could, and I saw repeatedly in the Western courts, the chief would, you know, admonish or yell at, you know, or just tell the man that, you know, this is not the way to treat your wife, or this is not the way to treat your widowed brother's wife, or something like that. And so the courts, for whatever reason, I don't know, maybe it was just the courts I visited, but there was a difference there. So through the British times, I would say one of the effects was that women's contributions to marriage in terms of beyond just fertility and that were kind of lessened. Some of the courts took a very hard line that the husband basically, whatever the woman produced in marriage belonged to the husband. Okay, some less so. So that brings us up. So, but women still had power, and they, you know, depending where you were. But they were now responsible for bringing forth more children. As I began to see people that were divorced after the birth of the fourth child, or the fifth, they're kind of a rationalization. And although the bride wealth, which is some people call dowry, but it's really bride wealth, went up, these rock, you know, the little that was decided in 1945 for each child didn't. So that created a disconnect as well.